Stand Watie was a prosperous slaveholding Cherokee planter and leader of the faction favoring removal, a signer of the fraudulent 1835 Treaty of New Echota, which forfeited Cherokee homeland in Georgia. The Cherokees had remained deeply factionalized since their removal, and the outbreak of war heightened the conflict. Those who had opposed removal now favored neutrality, but Watie's faction was more favorable to the Confederacy. Recruited by Pike, Watie had by mid-1861 organized the 1st Cherokee Rifles and was commissioned its colonel, followed by the 1st Choctaw and Chickasaw Mounted Rifles, raised by their longtime Indian agent Douglas Cooper. In August, a portion of Watie's command saw action at Oak Hills, a battle that assured the South's hold on Indian territory and made Watie a Confederate military hero.
Stand Watie is a very important individual. He is the only Brigadier General Indian in the entire Civil War. He received that after the defeats of the Confederates, and he was the only one remaining in Indian Territory that was having any success at all when Fort Gibson and Fort Smith are recaptured by the Union forces. Stand Watie has amazing success in Indian Territory, capturing Union supply trains coming out of Fort Scott. At one time, he even captures a steamboat that's coming up the river. Stand Watie heard that the river was rising, heard that a steamboat was coming, and he will, near Weber Falls, he will capture a Union steamboat and capture the supplies, and will give it to the refugees in Indian Territory. Watie is interesting. He is not only the only Brigadier General Indian in the entire Civil War, he is going to be the last general to surrender. He's not the last Confederate, but he is indeed the last general to surrender, which he will do on the 23rd of June of 1865 near Dokesville.
Further west, the Dana, who we call the Navajo, were forcibly removed from their Four Corners homeland. Although the Dana had signed treaties and were entitled to reserved lands, the U.S. Army commander in New Mexico, General James H. Carleton, carried out a removal plan by making war on them and their Mescalero Apache neighbors, destroying their fields, orchards, houses, and livestock. The Apache and Navajo who survived the attacks were starved into submission, finally surrendering at Canyon Duché in January 1864 to Kit Carson and his troops. Carson ordered the destruction of their property and organized their long walk to the new reservation at Bosque Redondo, a desolate tract on the Pecos River in eastern New Mexico, the first Indian reservation west of Oklahoma Indian Territory. Although Bosque Redondo was plagued by poor water and minimal firewood, the plan was to turn the Apache and Navajo into farmers, civilizing them. Traveling in harsh winter conditions for almost 2 months, some 8,500 Navajos died after arrival at the barren reservation. The Navajo people were forcibly marched almost 400 miles from the Four Corners to Bosque Redondo. About 200 Navajo died of cold and starvation, and more died after arrival at the barren reservation before the U.S. recognized the plan for civilizing the Navajo had failed and recognized their sovereignty in an 1868 treaty. The forced march is known as the Navajo Long Walk, yet another among many Trail of Tears suffered by Indian people. At war's end, there were no winners among the Indians of the West. It was a disaster for all of the Western people. Faced with choiceless choices, nothing they could have done would have saved them from the enormous loss of life, property, and political standing that befell them. Those who fought for the Confederacy were forced to negotiate new treaties with the United States, and many of those who remained loyal also found their reservations diminished. Further west, it would be decades before conflicts on the plains and in the Southwest would end. In November, Cooper led his 1,400 men, which included many so-called colored troops, toward the Pathleahola's encampment, determined to enlist them in the Confederacy or to drive him and his party from the country. Pathleahola led his band towards Kansas, doggedly pursued by Cooper and Watie. Pathleahola drove Cooper back at Round Mountain in November by firing the prairie grasses, but was outfought at Chustotolosol in December. Later in the month, another Confederate force routed Pathleahola at Chustin-Ala. Stand Watie's Cherokee pursued the fleeing refugees on what came to be known as the Trail of Blood on the Ice. More than 2,000 succumbed to the battles, disease, and bitter winter before reaching Kansas, where they learned supplies were not adequate and precious little military protection was to be had. Most had only the clothes on their back, and many more would die, including Apataleahola. Waddy's Cherokee were exempt from service outside Indian Territory, but early in 1862, he nonetheless led them into Arkansas to join Earl Van Dorn's command, opposing federal invasion of the region. In March, Waddy fought at Pea Ridge, also known as Elkhorn Tavern, where his Cherokees, holding one Confederate flank, captured an artillery battery, and following the federal victory, screened Van Dorn's withdrawal. That summer, Waddy was elected principal chief of the Confederate Cherokees. In 1864, he would be commissioned Brigadier General, the only Indian to reach the rank during the war, and given command of the Indian Brigade. Waddy fought in 18 battles and a multitude of skirmishes with many other Cherokees or Federal Creeks, Chickasaw, Seminole, Choctaw, and Delaware, and his wide-ranging raids occupied thousands of Federal troops needed in the East. Perhaps his greatest victories were the capture of a Federal steamboat, the J.R. Williams, in June 1864, and seizure of $1.5 million in supplies from the Second Battle of Cabin Creek 3 months later. When the end came in 1865, Waddy was the last Confederate general to surrender, laying down arms in June, 2 months after Lee surrendered at Appomattox.
One of the things that intrigues me, how this culture, which strikes me as very Western, very white in many ways, was driven out so easily from its native part of the country. I mean, we know some of the reasons why. There was apparently gold on the land, and the white man thought he should have the gold that the Indians shouldn't. But they had by then adopted so many of the white man's ways. They even had a newspaper printed in 2 languages, in their own language, which had been, a written version had been developed, and then also in English. So what their reasons for slavery were, I don't know if there's anything special other than this seems to be something that people do. They enslave one another and have done so for centuries.